not only is it not going away, I think there's just going to be a lot more engagement. But it's really a question of how you define engagement, because I think that means different things to different people. There's a spectrum of engagement, and I think what we're seeing today, what we've seen over the last couple of years, is a greater amount of engagement across the whole span of that spectrum. So we're seeing, I think, driven by asset owners, driven by the stewardship code, driven by a real desire by the beneficiaries of pension schemes, etc., for the managers to want to engage more and to act as owners where they're shareholders. But we're also seeing a growing interest initially from overseas, increasingly from homegrown investors as well, investors that want to take, as part of their business model, a more active approach to investment as well. So I think there's a number of different factors that are driving what is likely to be a much greater level of engagement in many different markets for many different reasons. Well, yeah, I think one of the things that we've seen from some of the larger campaigns is that there are many similarities as well as there are differences. Clearly, there are well-recognised cultural differences. Behaviour in some European countries is just different. The laws are different, the rules of engagement can be different. But in many cases, the issues that companies are facing and the challenges that are being identified by shareholders are very often the same. And even more importantly, many of the shareholders are the same. If you look at the top 20 shareholders of most big European companies, they tend to be the big global investment houses. Now that will vary case by case, but in almost all cases you'll see BlackRock and Norges and Legal & General and the usual list of suspects. And so you tend to find that the way in which some of the campaigns have been managed in the US that have been successful, the way in which shareholders have realised the benefits from working collectively, from engagement collectively, and from, in some cases, working very supportively with activist investors, has clearly been to the benefit of the company, of fellow shareholders, and multiple stakeholders. And I think that's being recognised increasingly, and perhaps a little later in Europe, but there's definitely evidence that that's what's happening. So the willingness of particularly other shareholders and the European arms of the global investors, and increasingly the European-based investors, to work constructively and supportively with activists is very different to what it was 5 years ago. 5 years ago, when I was working I was the vice chairman of an activist fund, we found talking to other shareholders quite difficult. Some would do it on the basis that they recognised that there was probably a depth of forensic analysis that might be incremental to what they'd seen before. But many were nervous because they just weren't sure of how they could be perhaps implicated in a campaign that they hadn't any ability to control. Today that concern has gone away. I think there are some exceptions, but in general I think the behaviour of activists has been demonstrably beneficial to fellow investors. I think the success of the campaigns has been very clear. And so the starting point for many traditional investors, the long-only community as they're described, is let's talk to these people. And that's a very different position to where we were 5 years ago. Well, I think the biggest change is this willingness of traditional conservative investors to work much more closely with activists. Whether it's investors actually proactively reaching out to activists where they have an issue which they feel needs some heavier lifting than they are able to do themselves, or whether it's just a willingness to engage with those activists and to hear their thesis and to sometimes then publicly support that thesis. The scale of companies which are being targeted is very different to that which was being seen as being realistic a few years ago. Today, nothing is too big. I think there's a recognition that an activist who may have a very large part of his portfolio in a company may still only have a very small percentage of the outstanding shares of a large company, but who has a valid point and who therefore has the ability to gain support from other stakeholders, and whether that's other shareholders or other interested parties, whether they're regulators or governments or advisors or trade unions or customers, they're very adept at working with all of those stakeholders and are very adept at getting arguments understood and supported by those stakeholders. So I think, as we've seen with Nestle, but as we've seen in countless other situations, there are larger companies being targeted. It may not be that a proxy battle is the logical conclusion of that, because if you own 0.5% of a company, it's quite difficult to start and be confident that you're going to win a proxy battle. But that doesn't mean to say that you can't start a very active and constructive engagement that brings about change in the corporation, and that's something that we're going to see more of, I think.